My name is Richard Drake. I teach history at the University of Montana. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about a book I published in 1989, The Revolutionary Mystique and Terrorism in Contemporary Italy. I'd also like to say something about why it is a good idea to bring the book out in a second edition 32 years later. In the book, I describe the terrorist violence that ravaged Italy during what the Italians call the years of lead from the late 1960s uh, into the 1980s. The research base for this book consisted of newspaper accounts, parliamentary inquiry reports, interviews, memoirs, and the intellectual history of the radical left and radical right in Italy. Both of those ideological traditions were deeply entrenched in that country. The book earned some good reviews. It won a prize, and thereafter, I wrote two other books that dealt with Italy's problems with terrorism. One of them, the Aldo Moro murder case, and the other one, a deep historical study of the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary tradition in Italy. So the revolutionary mystique and terrorism in contemporary Italy turned out to be the first part of a trilogy of books on Italy's revolutionary politics. Now, as with most scholarly monographs, this book eventually made its way to the remainder table. That is where it was on February 10th, 2017, when the New York Times published an article about one of the principal ideologues featured in my book. This was an article about Julius Evola, who in the post-World War II period presided as the leading philosopher of neo-fascism in Europe. Evola had come to the attention of the New York Times journalist when Steve Bannon, a key advisor to President Trump, cited Evola approvingly in an interview that he gave to the Italian media. The New York Times reporter immediately developed an interest in Evola at that point and began to read up on him. It was in the process of his research on Evola when he discovered my book, and eventually he interviewed me. He then did me the much appreciated favor of mentioning my book in his article and including an Amazon link to the book. And an ensuing period of brisk sales, despite the high hardback cost of the book and its relative scarcity, inspired me to think that a relatively inexpensive paperback edition of the book with a new introduction, updating the story, might find a new market of readers. I went to Indiana University Press, the original publisher of the book, with this idea. The editors at the press agreed with me. And now, 4 years later, having overcome some serious copyright problems concerning the book's photographs, the book is now available in a second edition. The Revolutionary Mystique and Terrorism in Contemporary Italy reappears at a moment when it might serve as a valuable resource for people wanting to learn about neo-fascism and Marxist-Leninism. Neo-fascism is already in the news, in the New York Times, no less. And people might wonder why this should be so. I think to answer that question, it's necessary to look at political developments on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, Bannon's positive assessment of Evola raised the question of the possible connections between the political ideas of the Trump administration and the neo-fascist tradition. That was enough of a reason for the New York Times to bestir itself and to find out what Evolianismo really meant. In Europe, Trump-like parties and movements have garnered enormous support. And the driving issue in right-wing populist political support, there are many issues, but the principal one has been non-white immigration coming from North Africa and the Middle East. The political anger and dismay that this immigration has engendered has really brought back into the political arena fascist and neo-fascist ideas about the racial and the cultural integrity of the collective. And so these ideas have really staged a comeback. It's amazing when you think of how dead and gone fascism appeared to have been in 1945 at the end of World War II, and how now these ideas, sometimes in a transformed manner, but nevertheless the deeper currents of the fascist ideological system are visible to people with a historical sense for these things. How extraordinary that comeback has been. And to acquire an understanding of that fascist and neo-fascist worldview, a very good place to begin is the life and work of Julius Evola. I offer a systematic analysis of his career, his writings in the book. Now, what about Marxist-Leninism? That's a very different story in the politics of our time. The radical left in Europe has subsided into abject political impotence. Mainly, I would argue, because of the destruction and disappearance of the Soviet Union. That was the sort of centerpiece, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which had engendered all of those other European communist parties. And when the Soviet Union failed, the god that failed, those other parties really suffered an annihilating defeat at that point. And yet, it seems to me that even the most discredited ideological systems have a way of coming back. The case of fascism would be a perfect illustration of that dialectic in political history. And as we think about Marxist-Leninism, it would be well to remember a historical lesson that no Marxist-Leninist ever forgets. In 1903, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had 20 followers. 14 years later, he was running Russia. And it's this kind of a dramatic surge of influence and power that inspires Marxist-Leninists today, the radical left today. I mean, what does it mean to be a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary? But to live in the confident expectation of hearing the crack of doom reverberate across the landscape of capitalist society and capitalist hegemonies. The two Marxist-Leninist thinkers I feature in the Revolutionary Mystique and Terrorism in Contemporary Italy are Raniero Panzieri and Tony Negri. In both of those cases, we find examples of exactly what the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary ideology entails. Living the revolution was the war cry of that radical left-wing constituency in Italy during the years of lead in the 60s and 80s. And so I think that we cannot foreclose on the possibility of a return of Marxist-Leninist ideas. And I think the Revolutionary Mystique and Terrorism in Contemporary Italy would be an excellent source of historical insight for people wanting to know exactly what that culture represented, what it aspired to achieve, and why it failed. And so I would close by saying that I hope that you will find in this book a satisfying historical account and also a primer of the potentially revolutionary politics of our ever darkening time.